For an entire country, in fact 2 countries, to go down in terms of an electricity grid collapsing is a pretty spectacular disaster. I think it's going to be a catastrophe for this government, in electoral terms as well as in economic terms. That means we have electricity that is 4 or 5 times more expensive for Brits than Americans. Realise that the world is a much more bottom-up emergent place. Nobody saw the search engine coming. Nobody saw the internet coming. Nobody saw the Silicon Revolution coming.
Welcome to the IEA Podcast. I'm Andy Mayer, COO and Energy Analyst, and today I am joined by Matt Ridley, a former businessman, former Conservative peer, and author of many fabulous books, which I strongly encourage you to read, including The Rational Optimist, The Evolution of Everything, and my personal favourite, How Many Light Bulbs Does It Take to Change the World?, which was co-published with the IEA. And if you want to know more about the sort of books that the IEA published, please find us on the Insider Substack. But moving swiftly on, Matt, one of your favourite topics is energy. And I don't know if you noticed in the news today, there was something of an incident in the Iberian Peninsula. I was just wondering what your take on that was.
Well, Andy, I've learnt a lot about energy and other topics from you over the years, so it's an honour to be with you, and thanks for having me on. For an entire country, in fact 2 countries, to go down in terms of an electricity grid collapsing is a pretty spectacular disaster, because when you think about how much more dependent we are on reliable energy, reliable electricity than we ever have been. And that's a good thing. It's making our lives easier in lots of ways to have electricity available 24/7 and reliable. So that's great. If we've now entered an era where it's not so reliable, and we've had some pretty big near misses in the UK too, in fact, some quite big power cuts, there is a common theme here. And that is that you are trying to make grids less dependent on traditional spinning turbines of the kind that fossil fuels in particular supply, but also nuclear.
This is quite a complicated area.
Yeah.
And one of the phrases that you coined was unreliables to describe the influence of wind and solar in a mixed electricity system. But I think people get quite confused as to whether or not it was the case there wasn't enough energy on the Spanish grid, or whether there was too much, and why that might matter.
Yes, and we don't know for sure. And one of the suspicious things about it is that it's taking them several days to sort of come up with an explanation of exactly what happened. And there's a distinct lack of curiosity of a kind that there wouldn't be if they thought it wasn't something to do with the unreliables. Uh-huh. And I do call them unreliables because you can't get away from the fact that they produce energy unpredictably, intermittently, and often at the wrong times. So on a June afternoon in the UK, there's tons of solar power. That's the time we least need energy. Now, let's store it then. That's unbelievably expensive. Storing electricity is a very, very expensive thing. So it isn't like something you can manufacture and then stock in a warehouse and produce when you need it. It's got to be made ready, not just hour by hour, but millisecond by millisecond. And this is what went wrong in Spain, is that the frequency collapsed. Okay. The frequency went wrong. What keeps the frequency within 0.15 hertz or whatever it has to be to make sure that it doesn't go wrong is the inertia in the system. And the inertia comes from literally big physical things going round at the right speed. Now, you don't have...
But wind turbines turn round. Does that not create inertia?
Well, that's an interesting question. And I think not, because the wind turbines are not going around at this exact speed. That's the point. If they're going around at exactly the right speed, they're producing exactly the right frequency. Wind turbines are producing direct current, not alternating current. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't produce the inertia. The alternating current has to be turned by transformers the direct current has to be turned into alternating current from the wind turbines. So the problem can be you get a gust of wind, or you get a burst of sunshine when the sun comes out from behind a cloud or something, and that can cause a spike of electricity to be generated, which rushes down the wires, and if the system is not quite quick enough at adjusting, that can cause the frequency to spike too high or too low, and that can cause a lot of things to trip off, so either suppliers or users of the electricity.
In household terms, it's rather like if there's a power surge and it blew up your toaster. except
Exactly.
the kit or the grid itself.
Yeah.
And in the Spanish case, there are protection systems in place to stop that damage happening. And I believe the theory now is that cascade began, which then went all the way up to the French border with successive pieces of kit noticing an imbalance and shutting the grid down in order for the damage not to spread. And then the debate that's happened since has been around whether the trigger event was something fairly normal for grid, like a lightning strike or a weather event, or something fairly conspiratorial like a cyber attack, or very simply a solar farm went offline, then another one did, and within 5 seconds the cascade had echoed to shut the whole thing down.
Yes, the point is not that the solar or wind thing starts it necessarily, although that can happen too. It's that it makes it cascade into chaos quite quickly. It makes it more likely to do that. And we saw that with a gas-fired power station malfunctioning a few years ago in the UK, which caused a ripple in the system, which caused a big wind farm to trip off, and that then caused a big blackout for several hours in parts of eastern England. So the people like me, less me, I'm not an expert on the electricity grid, but I followed this. But people who know a lot about it, Catherine Porter, Andrew Montford, people like that, have been warning for years in very systematic and detailed terms that we are building an electricity grid that is more vulnerable to collapses and blackouts, and indeed price spikes. Because remember, if you suddenly get a very still cold day in January when there's no wind and no sunlight either, and then you can't top up the grid because you haven't got enough gas-fired power station, you have to go out into the market and say, anybody in Europe got some power? If so, we'll pay you an enormous amount of money for it. So that's a price spike that results. So quite often you head off the blackout, but at the cost of putting the price of electricity up.
So the UK government is not unaware of this, and the headline...
Really? It pretends it is.
Well, so they are aware. The National Energy System Operator is the energy security regulator, so they issued a paper in May of 2024 that warned the government of some of these risks. And obviously, out of concern, this week the government has decided that they're going to make it compulsory to put rooftop solar panels on every new build home, and possibly some warehouses and other things as well. Is this something that may cause further problems? Are you saying?
Well, this is the head in the sand attitude, isn't it? It's truly clumsy, at the very least, to make an announcement that you're going to put more solar on in the very week that too much solar or too unreliable solar has caused a problem in an entire country. Now, if there's a bunch more solar panels on the roofs of British houses, it probably isn't, in the big scheme of things, enough to make that much of a difference. But if it's not enough to make a difference to the problem, then it's not worth having it anyway, because it's not going to make much of a solution. I've been writing about solar recently, and I used the term the square root of sod all for the output of UK solar farms in December. Mm-hmm. And I was challenged by this. Somebody complained to the press regulator that I shouldn't have used this term. And the press regulator, instead of saying get lost, investigated and demanded a justification from me for this term. So I said, well, it's very simple. The square root of sod all is a highly technical metric used in the industry to describe the output of a solar farm in the middle of winter. They didn't like that, or rather the newspaper thought I was being facetious for some reason. So I justified it by pointing out that electricity demand is roughly 40% higher in winter than summer in the UK. Solar output from solar farms in the UK under similar conditions is about 5% in December of what it is in June. Mm-hmm. So you've got 40% more demand and 95% less supply. That is not a useful way to run an electricity grid.
Did you win?
I did win. The IPSO, the press regulator, came out with a lengthy report on all my alleged mistakes, saying that I hadn't made any mistakes, and in particular devoted, I think, 3 paragraphs to discussion of the square root of sod all, in which it said that it understood that this was intended as a humorous remark. So I now have it officially determined by an official body that the output of solar farms in winter is the square root of sod all. So I call it a squarosa.
Brilliant. So, I mean, British Solar can't produce light or heat in winter, but it can create a chilling effect on free speech. And
Roughly speaking, yeah.
But if you wish to make facetious remarks, we at the IEA do support free speech, so please do go ahead. We will welcome
I probably just did.
Now, I've spent possibly too long on current affairs, and we should probably go back into the underlying policy and where we are now after 25 years of climate policy, energy policies, and net zero. What's your take on the current government stance and where they're going?
Well, I think it's going to be a catastrophe for this government in electoral terms as well as in economic terms. We now have the highest electricity prices in the world. Okay, the developed world or whatever.
Is that all electricity prices or just for industrial?
Well, according to David Turver, who did the calculations, who dug them out of the statistics, it's now both industrial and domestic. For a while, we were top of the league in industrial, but not top of the league in domestic. We're now top of the league in both. And, you know, that means we have electricity that is 4 or 5 times more expensive for Brits than Americans. Mm-hmm. Electricity is an absolutely vital part of many businesses, not just steel makers with electric arc furnaces and that kind of thing, but AI, data centers have to use electricity, etc. So it is lethally economically suicidal to have pushed electricity prices up to the degree that we have. And there is an attempt going on by the government and its chums in the crony capitalist unreliables industry to pretend that this is nothing to do with lovely cheap renewables. They've been saying that renewables are cheap for so long that they think it's true, but it's not, because you can prove it by looking at the accounts of renewables companies or looking at the prices that they're paid or looking at the subsidies that they're given. These are very expensive ways of producing electricity. Some are more expensive than others. Offshore wind is extremely expensive. Onshore wind can be almost as cheap as gas. And
so just a fact check, 9 times cheaper than gas is not a real statistic for renewables.
No, what they would have done when they did that calculation and came up with that number some years ago, and they're not using it anymore, I notice, they would have left out a lot of the costs. So the subsidies for building the power lines to get it from the wind farm to where people live, for example. The subsidies for the backup power stations that have to be kept ready for the times when the wind doesn't blow.
And those backups are fossil fuel power stations.
The best backup is open cycle gas turbines, which, by the way, produce more emissions than combined cycle, but they're more responsive. So the best backups are those, because those kind of gas turbines can be fired up and down very quickly within minutes or even seconds. Now, the problem is if you're going to invest in one of those, it's going to cost you a lot of money. If it's going to sit idle for half the time because the wind happens to be blowing, then how are you going to justify spending all the money on the plant, because you're not going to get paid for the electricity? Well, the way you're going to get justified is they're going to give you a subsidy too. That's called the capacity market. This is a euphemism for subsidizing fossil fuels to back up unreliables. So the whole system is being built twice over at the moment. We're building an unreliable system and we're building a reliable backup one for it. Now we're having to pay for both. And then on top of that, we're blowing up coal-fired power stations and gas-fired power stations before the end of their useful life. Right? And other countries are blowing up their nuclear power stations in the same way. Now, if you blow up something before the end of its useful life, then you're wasting an asset. You're stranding an asset is another way of putting it, but you're replacing an asset 10 years, 20 years sooner than you need to. Well, that costs money. It's not growth, it's replacement, which is, I'm no technical economist, but just because you're digging another hole to replace a hole doesn't mean that you're richer.
I mean, government isn't necessarily getting everything wrong, though, isn't it? It's quite keen on a revival of nuclear power in the UK.
Belatedly, yes.
Talk to me more about that. I mean, is that going to work?
Nuclear is a terribly difficult issue because it's the one reliable that is low carbon. It takes up much less space than fossil fuels, but much, much less space than unreliables. So these are huge advantages. It's a secure system. You can basically have enough fuel to keep you going. You don't need to worry about importing it and that kind of thing. All of that is great. The problem is that somewhere between Three Mile Island in 1979 or whenever it was, and Chernobyl and Fukushima, we drove the price of nuclear through the roof. And we did it by saying, whatever happens, we must be ultra, 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 ultra safe. Mm-hmm. And making something 99% safer costs a lot of money. Making it 99.999% safer costs infinitely more. So we've driven the price of nuclear to the point where it's not economic to build it. And that's what we've got to get away from. So it's taking us till 2030 from about 2012 to build Hinkley C. That's about when it's going to come on stream. China has just announced 25 nuclear power stations, I think it is. It's some large number anyway, which it will start building now, and they will come on stream in 2030. So someone out there knows how to do it much quicker and much cheaper. And, you know, the inputs into nuclear power stations are things like steel, concrete, but the one, and you put more steel and more concrete into them now than you used to, and you're not allowed to change the design without going back to the regulator, which is a very stupid way of learning how to be quicker at things. But the input that's really gone up is paper. We need far more paper for every gigawatt of nuclear power station we build. And by that, I mean, of course, environmental impact statements and all this stuff, all of which cost an absolute fortune because it's expert people doing it.
You've nicely segued into your other main area of interest there, which is how innovation happens. Mm-hmm. And why would it matter if somebody had to go back to a regulator every time they wanted to move a pipe in a nuclear power station?
Well, there's a general rule, I can't remember who it's named after, that the more often you make something, the cheaper it gets. Mm-hmm. Learning by doing is another way of describing this, that, you know, you with practice, you can make things cheaper. So if you can roll something off a production line, then you can drive down the cost pretty dramatically. You know, when you think what we've done to the cost of all sorts of everyday goods, you know, we've made them extraordinarily cheap by this practice of doing it again and again, and mm-hmm. learning how to save a little bit of money here and save a little bit of money there, and just do lots of things at the same time because you're making lots of them and things like that. So that whole process saves money. And we've never done that with nuclear power stations. We've always built them like Egyptian pyramids, you know, one at a time when a pharaoh dies. So you have to start all over again. You have to reinvent all the engineering. You have to reinvent all the technology. You have to hire the firm from the beginning. You have to draw up the contracts, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And so I think that is a crucial part of innovation, is that when you innovate to drive down the cost of something, you do it by experiment, by trial and error, by sharing ideas, and as I say, by just doing it over and over again. And we don't do that we do that not with nuclear power stations and quite a lot of other things. We've got out of the habit of remembering how innovation does drive down prices. If you say every time you want a new product, you must come back and talk to us, the government regulator, then you'd never get a car improved. We'd have Model Ts still.
So how should it work? So if we wanted to revitalise the nuclear industry in this country and do it in a way that we didn't do in the 20th century, which was still heavily regulated, what could it look like?
Well, it's very difficult to describe it without sounding like you want to take a higher risk. Mm-hmm. But I genuinely don't think you are if you do it properly. This is why I've always been in favour of the idea of small modular nuclear reactors. Because if they're modular, then you can basically, you know, build an egg crate and then put eggs in them. You know, and each egg is a small reactor.
And just for comparison, how small is small?
Well, this is the question. Rolls-Royce talks about small modular reactors being 400 megawatts. That's a lot smaller than most big nuclear power stations, but it's still pretty big, mm-hmm. and it's still pretty well a one-off each time you build it. I think we need to be talking about 50 megawatt units that can be literally manufactured in a factory by the dozen, mm-hmm. and then transported and placed in a system that is probably an old power station of some other kind, and switched on one by one as you add more to them. Now, the Canadian nuclear regulator did something a few years ago to make it easier for nuclear power companies to think in those terms. Mm-hmm. And in particular, what a lot of nuclear designers say we should be doing is producing industrial heat with nuclear power stations as well as electricity. By that, I mean very, very hot temperatures that can be useful in chemical processes and so on. That's a really useful output from a nuclear that you can't get from a solar panel, and you can't really get it from a gas turbine either. And for that, you need to think about other designs. You need to think about much more inherently safe designs. Nuclear power is very, very safe. Mm-hmm. It kills fewer people than any other way of making electricity per unit of power that you produce, by a mile. And I mean, people die installing solar panels on roofs. People die climbing up wind turbines, etc. So there's no risk-free way of making power, but there is. Chernobyl was a really idiotic design run by a really bad regime in a really bad way, and it killed quite a few people, but nothing like as many as die in the energy industry every year anyway. And that was the worst. Fukushima killed almost nobody. 3 Mile Island killed almost nobody.
And that zero risk approach, where's it come from?
Well, the as low as reasonably achievable is the standard that the nuclear regulator operates to. And this is based on the idea of the linear no threshold model of radiation, which says that there is no safe level of radiation, that, it doesn't matter. It's linear. The relationship between risk and radiation is linear, that even if you produce a tiny bit, you produce a tiny bit of risk and so on. Lots of evidence suggests that's not right. Below a certain level of radiation, we have background radiation anyway. We have it coming out of the rocks. We have it coming out of the sun and so on. Below a certain level of radiation, our bodies are designed to repair the DNA and cope with it. Mm-hmm. And all the evidence suggests that it's quite safe. So to tolerate a minuscule amount of radiation would be massively cost-saving in the industry, in the design at least.
So a lot of fear has been generated. But if we take ourselves out of energy now and just talk about that in a wider context, zero risk seems to be the default setting for most Western governments across most areas at the moment. And is that something that has come about because of things like fears of nuclear power and GM crops and other stuff? Or is it more to do with the need to be re-elected and just a rational response from politicians to the needs of the public?
I think where it's come from is something that I don't fully understand, but I think it's always been easier for activists to exaggerate potential risks and scare people than it has been for proponents of technologies to minimize risks and reassure people. If an industry comes along and says, no, don't worry your little head, we're going to be fine, of course you take it with a pinch of salt, and so you should. But if Greenpeace comes along and says...
Sorry for listeners, just a pinch of salt, not too much, not too little. Very, very dangerous stuff, salt.
Fair point. If an environmental pressure group comes along and says there is a possibility that a genetically modified wheat plant could take over the world and destroy the rainforest and poison people, and I were to say that is a very remote possibility, then I've lost the argument straight away. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, that sounds a mega risk. Why are you even prepared to accept even a remote possibility? But of course, in effect, that number has to be zero. I remember having this argument 20 years ago with a senior Quangocrat who hated genetically modified crops and was doing her absolute utmost to stop them being adopted. And she said, what do you think about, super weeds? If we put new genes in plants, they might turn into super weeds. And I said, when was the last time wheat was a problem in your garden? Well, that's not right. It is relevant. It's exactly the same point. That why would a weed suddenly become a superweed? What she meant by that was this weed might be resistant to herbicide. Well, I thought you didn't use herbicide in your garden, Barbara, I said. Do you see what I mean? I thought you didn't like herbicides. Surely you don't do. That's not a superweed. That's just a weed that's resistant to a herbicide.
I mean, is the fear she's expression, though, more an articulation of an inability to understand trade-offs?
Well, that's a very big part of it, is that we've made we've gone to the extreme, and we're weighing hypothetical risks against. We're not allowed to weigh them against hypothetical benefits. That's a definition of the precautionary principle. I think you'd agree, Andy. And so, if you were to say, I think GM crops could potentially do real environmental harm, so we need to be really careful before we adopt them. And I would say, I think they can do real potential good, therefore we should adopt them to save lives. Why isn't my argument just as valid as yours? But in effect, the debate has always been that you must listen to potential risks about the future, but not potential benefits about the future.
Okay, so let's imagine that to escape this nonsense, the super weeds and the bureaucracy infesting the British state, we create Ridley Island offshore. much like Radio Caroline was a rogue state next to the United Kingdom. What would you do there to encourage entrepreneurs and innovators to come together to create the new world that you want?
Well, the one-word answer is freedom. The lesson of innovation that I draw from my book, How Innovation Works, across the piece is freedom to experiment, freedom to fail, freedom to try again, freedom to back your ideas, freedom to disagree with people, freedom to borrow ideas from other people, etc., etc. So, even, for example, the intellectual property system, I think, quite often gets in the way. But that's a glib, abstract answer, I admit. I mean, of course, I'm not going to be so free that there's no police force, there's no chemical monitoring, etc., etc. So the way that would manifest itself in practice is much lighter regulation that weighed the benefits of innovation against the disbenefits rather than just the disbenefits. So I think it was you who coined this. It was called the innovation principle, that we must take into account the potential good a new technology can do as well as the bad. But there are quite simple things I would do, like faster decision making. It strikes me as absolutely widespread in this country in particular that there is a lethargic and sluggish approach to taking decisions. And again, I hear businessmen for whom time is money. They raise some money, they're paying it out in terms of salaries or running costs. And so they've got a limited time to achieve their, breakthrough in the market. So they desperately need quick decisions out of government regulators, and they don't get them. Whether it's the planning system or the environmental regulators or whatever, you get we'd like you to do more studies, or we can't answer that question because he's on a course, or we will answer your question within 3 months. 3 months is up. We're now asking for another 3 months to answer your question, etc., etc. So and then on top of that, you need to have a basic permissionless innovation system, which we have in some areas. If I want to invent some new software, I don't have to go to Public Health England or the Environment Agency and say, do you mind if I invent some new software? So there are lots of areas where we could be like that. And that's why software is a pretty dynamic thing, actually, because people don't have to get permission to try and invent something. So these are the principles that will apply on Ridley Island. When do I get to start?
I think it would be a question of whether or not we could find the right land.
Well, I think I've got an answer to that. The Dogger Bank is only about 15 meters under the water in some places. The Chinese would build a bloody great island out there, and in no time it would just take dropping a few rocks, and you're off to the races. Put a flag on, have all sorts of strict policies about who can come and take part. And you've got to be an entrepreneur to go and base yourself there, and we're off to the races. When do we start?
Well, I think the government has just intervened to put a marine conservation zone over the Dogger Bank. So we are stuck in the UK dealing with the bureaucrats and trying to reform them. But okay, so let's talk about the underlying theory of why people behave in that way and how.
Sorry, can I just interrupt to say, by the way, I was being facetious again, just in case you get too many complaints.
Ofcom obviously now do have to regulate speech on social media, so we will watch for that. I was edited appropriately for the regime.
I wasn't being horrible to place and soul. Sorry, I interrupted you.
So in your new book, Birds, Sex and Beauty, you look at some of the underlying theory of evolution, which has been a theme in some of your other work as well, and how this relates to the way things really are and why that's such a good thing. Could you talk a little bit about that and how it links into some of these theories?
Yes, I could. It's a very different book, but it's very similar to some of the books I wrote quite a long time ago about evolution. I've written about evolution and innovation in my career, I think is a sort of glib way of summarizing it. But I see them as two ends of the same spectrum. So I think we underestimate the degree to which technological innovation is actually an evolutionary phenomenon that we have very little control over. It's going to happen inexorably, and it happens by trial and error, which is another word for natural selection, and so on. Let me give you an example as to what of how that is. When the internet was invented, very soon afterwards, lots and lots of companies invented search engines, and Google scooped the pool, but there were lots of others before that. Mm-hmm. And if Larry Page had never met Sergey Brin, we'd still have search engines. It's inevitable once the internet gets invented that search engines are going to emerge. And you can look at that and say, weren't we clever? We invented it. Or you can look at that and say, wasn't that just an evolution? By the way, I think the search engine is one of the most useful innovations of my lifetime. I use it every day. And nobody saw it coming, by the way. There's nobody in the 1980s saying, somebody's going to make a lot of money out of search once we've got these computers networked. So that's a sort of example of how, and another example would be to say you fly in an airplane, you expect it to be designed by an intelligent designer, not by an evolutionary process, right? Mm-hmm. Well, hang on a minute. That designer took a previous design and adapted it, and that previous design did the same all the way back to the Wright brothers, who themselves picked up ideas from gliders and kites and other people they were talking to.
So just to be clear, the invention of powered flight was not the result of a mission-orientated government industrial policy.
Actually, it was the very opposite, because there was a guy called Samuel Langley who did get $25,000, a lot of money in those days, off the American government for a mission-oriented project to invent flight. They thought they'd picked a winner. And he was indeed a very clever fella. I mean, he was head of the Smithsonian Institution. He was an astrophysicist. There's no spots on Samuel.
They had the right experts in the room.
They'd got the right chap. Yeah. And he said to himself, look, I'm so clever that there's no point in me talking to anyone else. I'm going to do this in secret. And then, because I know it's going to work, I'm going to unveil it in front of a crowd of people on the Potomac River in October 1903. And here we go. And he did so. And the pilot he'd chosen had taken the precaution of putting on a cork-lined suit. And sure enough, he was in the water in 20 feet. But 8 weeks later, on an island off North Carolina, two bicycle mechanics without a degree between them, Orville and Wilbur Wright, succeeded where Langley had failed, to the fury of the government, and the intelligentsia didn't believe them. The Scientific American ran an article saying, if two bicycle mechanics from Ohio have invented powered flight, then we would know about it. Well, they didn't. So my point is, so I'm still at one end of the spectrum, saying that innovation is a much more evolutionary phenomenon than we get. But at the other end of the spectrum, evolution by natural selection is a bit more like innovation in some respects too. And by that I mean it can be directed. So if if your and my ancestors took up dairy farming, not because they had a mutation that enabled them to digest milk as adults, unlike every other human being, but that enabled that mutation to then spread. So their own evolution was determined by a cultural tradition that they had invented. So here we've got an innovation driving human evolution. And in the latest book, which is called Bird, Sex and Beauty, I write very specifically about this phenomenon of sexual selection, which is the way in which selective mate choice can alter a species very dramatically indeed. Now, the mates are doing this consciously. I mean, they may not be doing it intellectually in the case of birds, but they're doing it consciously. They're saying, I want to mate with that guy because he's got a long tail. And so they are driving the evolution of the species in the same way that a chicken breeder is driving the evolution of a chicken. So there's more direction at the biological end of the spectrum than we think, and there's more random emergence at the technological end of the spectrum than we think. That's one of the arguments that, I don't specifically make it in the latest book, but it does mean that all these different books I write do all have the same theme.
For the government, who hopefully will be trying to learn some lessons about how to take the UK back on a path of becoming an innovation and growth superpower of some description, what could they learn from this? What should they change in their approach in order to benefit?
I think the main thing is to see the world in a much more bottom-up, much less top-down way. Their idea of innovation at the moment is winner picking by clever people. That somewhere in Whitehall there's somebody who knows which technology we should champion next. And in the way, this is what worries me about ARIA. I think it's going to go down that route, and dimming the sun is the latest breeze in a week when they're saying put more solar panels on your roof and we're going to dim the sun. Chaps, what about a bit of joined up government? But anyway, so to realize that the world is a much more bottom up emergent place. Nobody saw the search engine coming. Nobody saw the internet coming. Nobody saw the Silicon Revolution coming, etc. These things are going to emerge from the interactions of ordinary people, much more than they're going to be imposed by the bright ideas of clever people from above. So create the conditions under which people do experiments. Cheap energy, number one. Quick decisions, number two. Freedom to meet, mix, and for ideas to have sex. That's a phrase that I'm afraid is going to be on my tombstone because I coined it, and I keep getting it quoted back to me.
It could be worse. His ideas never had sex. No.
So those are the sort of ingredients. And to come back to energy policy here, I think it's very instructive that nobody in the energy field that I meet these days wakes up and thinks, how do I respond to the consumer? They wake up and think, how do I persuade the government to give me a grant? How do I persuade the government to give me permission? How do I persuade some big business to partner with me or something like that? Nowhere in the system are you and me saying, excuse me, I want cheap, affordable and reliable energy. Nowhere in the system is that voice being heard. And 30 years ago it was. Nigel Lawson tore up the top-down central electricity generating board system and replaced it with a bottom-up one in which there was a dash for gas and a dramatic drop in the price of electricity and an increase in the reliability of electricity.
And a decrease in carbon emissions as well.
And a decrease in carbon emissions, yeah. And that was responding to the consumer, whereas now the only people that matter are the Climate Change Committee and the venture capitalists in the City of London who are going to make a fortune out of investing in your wind farm, and the subsidies that are going to be forced out of my and your pocket to pay for all this stuff. It's all about the producer, not the consumer.
So there's a wise expression that governments that lose power, and that risk has become more real in the last year or so. The Norwegian government has collapsed. Arguably, energy prices have contributed to rising populism across the continent, and although not quite the same story in America. There's clearly a populist government there now. How big a threat is this to the kind of world where people can mix freely and exchange ideas and operate in a bottom-up fashion?
Well, just on your point about the threat of losing power, you remember Keir Starmer is going to go into the next election having just told us we can't buy a diesel car, effectively, or a petrol car, and having told us we can't buy a gas boiler. I mean, the deadlines for those are sort of about the same as the next general election. Good luck with that in my part of the world. In cold, not very sunny, rural Northumberland. It's not going to be an easy sell. Now, it might be that suddenly you'll find a way of getting the electricity price down, and therefore the fact that my car runs on electricity and my heating runs on electricity won't bother me. But at the moment, it's going in the opposite direction. So there's a real issue there. But I think what you're getting at is that the rise of populism as a result of dumb energy policies, among other things, dumb immigration policies also, but we shouldn't neglect energy here. The rise of populism is leading to a rise of economic nationalism, which is threatening, in the end, your and my ability to purchase whatever we feel like from whoever we come across, wherever they are in the world, whatever their creed, whatever their color, whatever their ethnic origin, and that for a country that won the argument for unilateral free trade on behalf of the consumer, don't care about the producer. I'm talking about the Corn Laws here. For a country that won that argument nearly 200 years ago, to be facing the prospect that we've got to have that argument all over again is a very depressing one for me.
Well, I was saying that most interviews with you end on the same question, which is, how can you describe yourself as a rational optimist? And you sort of just knocked that question out of the park. So, well, what is there to be optimistic and cheerful about, despite all of that?
Globally, I'm still a techno-optimist. I mean, a lot of my pessimism is reserved for the UK and Europe. But globally, I think we're going to go on inventing things. I think we're going to go on driving down the price of satisfying human needs. And I think we're going to go on driving up the living standards of people all around the world. This has been the most spectacular decade and a half since I wrote The Rational Optimist for Africans, for example. They've got rich much faster than people on most of the other continents. That's great news because they were really poor at the beginning of that time. Many of them still are, so there's a long way to go. So I think globally we will improve human living standards. But there's a chart which I often refer to, which the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change commissioned from economists, which is the 5 scenarios of what might happen in the 21st century. And the lowest one shows hardly any growth in per capita income in this century, and the highest one shows a spectacular improvement in per capita income. So that the average human being is about 14 times as well off as he is today in real terms. Right, so the average Nigerian will be way richer than the average American is today by 2100. How do they describe that world that they plugged in to get that scenario? They describe it as having very high emissions, boo, because it has free enterprise, low taxes, rapid innovation, good social progress. Now, my point is that world is probably unattainable, not because the technology couldn't deliver it, but because government regulation won't let us deliver it, either because of the emissions or because of something else. And by the way, the emissions are only going to lower it from 14 times to 12 times as rich or something. That's the calculation that comes out too.
I mean, can we get some optimism from the complete mess that the Trump administration has made of trying to reverse the economic laws of nature on protectionism?
Yes, I agree. I agree with you. I think Cobden is having a good laugh right now in the sky at what Trump is learning the hard way, and he should have listened to the IEA and a number of others. But yeah, my point is that I am optimistic, but what I'm really cross about, what I'm really pessimistic about, is the opportunity cost of not having better policies and realizing better human living standards for everybody and better environmental outcomes, by the way, because if we get that rich, we can solve every environmental problem we can think of.
I guess my hope is that some governments, and I think Tony Blair has kicked this off a little bit, are going to look at Spain this week and think maybe we need to be more pragmatic. I don't want them to stop caring about the environment or worrying about the temperature of the planet, but I do want them to think harder on what you've said, which is the idea that these things can change from the bottom up faster, better, more creatively, in a way that people can live with, rather than the way that it's happening in Europe today.
I think Tony Blair is no fool. I think he knows what's going on. He's been muttering one or two things like this before. He said it much more explicitly this week. He's rowed back from it. Of course he does, he has to stay in the tent, as it were. But, had we said 20 years ago, other countries can do solar and wind if they want, but here in Britain, we're going to do gas as our main way of making electricity and our main way of heating houses. We're going to phase out coal, a lot of gas, and meanwhile, we're going to get the cost of nuclear down, and then we'll replace gas with nuclear as and when we can. That gas to nuclear road would have been way cheaper. And in fact, of course, because of all the shale gas under our feet, we'd have been a major exporter. And look at America. America is now the biggest producer of gas and oil in the world.
And funding innovation with that.
And funding a huge amount of innovation and attracting industry back to its shores, etc. So we would then, as you say, have been able to afford to fund innovation into alternative technologies that might be fusion or it might be something else that would also be low emissions, and that because imagine if we take all the pain of a transition to unreliables and it almost gets us to net zero, and then in 2055 someone cracks fusion, we say, why did we bother?
We're looking remarkably like that bat tunnel on HS2.
Exactly.
On that happy note, thank you, Matt. I do encourage you to look at the show notes and buy some of Matt's excellent books. And if you want to live in that fusion-driven, optimistic, bright future world, then do continue to subscribe to the IEA through our Insider Substack and keep listening to the podcast. Thank you very much. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Annie.